On the eve of war, 378,000 Jews lived in Warsaw, over 33% of the population. Nearly half of them earned their living from industry or artisanship, mostly owning small factories or worked in handicrafts. 30% were in commerce and 15% in the liberal professions. Warsaw was the centre of every aspect of Jewish life. On September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded and within 3 weeks had captured the city. Immediately, the Jewish community became the target of horrific oppression. On the 4th of October 1939, Adam Chernikov was ordered to establish a 24-man strong Jewish council. He was an educated man and an engineer who had previously acted as deputy head of the Jewish community. The Judenrat were expected to obey all demands, which included the recruitment of forced labourers. The restrictions tightened. All Jews had to wear armbands. There was a ban on travel. All radios were confiscated, and by November, Jews had to deposit all their money into blocked bank accounts. By February 4th, 1940, Jews had to hand in a list of all their possessions. Many were destitute. A further 90,000 Jews fled into Warsaw from the countryside. In January 1940, there was a wave of muggings by Polish thugs. In April 1940, the Germans designated the future ghetto for all Warsaw Jews and the refugees. All Poles living in the designated areas had to leave, and on the 2nd of October 1940, the ghetto was established. The gates were guarded by Germans and Poles on the outside and the Jewish police on the inside, who worked for the Judenrat. The ghetto was surrounded by 10-foot-high walls and barbed wire. The designated space was about 1,000 acres, and at its height, 500,000 people were crammed into the ghetto. On average, there were 13 people per room, and many thousands were homeless. The calorific rations appointed for Germans was 2,310, for Poles 634, and for Jews 184 per day. The lack of sanitation meant that typhus spread in the ghetto. Over 100,000 people died in the ghetto of starvation and disease. Bands of children roamed the streets begging for food. And yet, cultural, academic and spiritual activity continued. Information was disseminated, underground libraries operated, and a huge chronicle was assembled to tell the story of the ghetto. It was called Oneg Shabbat and was the brainchild of an extraordinary man called Emanuel Ringelblum. He began it in September 1939 and collected over 6,000 documents with some 35,000 pages. He was a historian whose speciality was the history of the Jews of Warsaw. He was a member of Pole Zion, left-wing Zionist, and also had a devotion to Yiddish culture. He and his family were resettled into the Warsaw Ghetto, where he was involved in 4 spheres of activity. He worked in a self-help institute and worked with the underground in the cultural affairs section. He established and administered the Oneg Shabbat archive and kept up-to-date records, including articles on specific subjects concerning life in the ghetto. A great humanitarian, he ran a network of soup kitchens for the desperately poor and promoted a growth of volunteers to help with the growing desperation that people felt. He also made the soup kitchens into clubs to keep the people connected with each other and arranged lectures, meetings and concerts. Ringelblum realized that there was no precedent for the Nazi occupation. He said, "It was important that future historians have available to them accurate records of the events that are taking place." He managed to attract a large circle of activists and succeeded in gaining support for the archive from every political group. As reported by Kirsh, the secretary and only survivor of the team, every item, every article, the long or short, had to pass through Dr. Ringelblum's hands. For weeks and months, he spent the night poring over the manuscripts, adding his comments and instructions. During the last stages, he collected every document and piece of evidence, relating to the deportations and murders and passed them on to the Polish underground. The archive also issued a bulletin which enabled the underground to keep abreast of news. Ringelblum continued writing up to the last months of his life, which he spent hiding with Poles outside the ghetto. It was in that period that he wrote about Jewish and Polish relations. After the Great Deportation, he became an advocate of armed resistance, but on the eve of Pesach 1943, he went back into the ghetto. Together with his family and 30 others, he hid in an underground refuge and continued writing. His hideout was discovered, and he and his family were murdered. The archives were buried in milk churns, and at the end of the war, many of them were discovered.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.